Sometimes manipulation feels like love. Sometimes control sounds like concern. It can come wrapped in softness, in warmth, in a voice that says, "I'm only trying to help you." And that is what makes it so hard to recognize. You imagine manipulation as something sharp, loud, aggressive. But the most dangerous kind is quiet. It comes without force. It comes through guilt, silence, subtle pressure. It comes through the fear of disappointing someone you care about. Have you ever agreed to something you didn't want just to keep the peace? Have you ever swallowed your own needs because speaking them felt like a risk? Or have you ever noticed yourself choosing your words carefully, not because honesty mattered, but because you were afraid of how someone might react? If so, you know that manipulation isn't always a battle fought on the surface. Sometimes it's the negotiation happening inside your own mind. Picture a moment. You're sitting beside someone you love. You want to say no. You want to explain how you feel, but your chest tightens. Your thoughts start twisting. If I say this, will they be disappointed? If I say no, will they leave? So you stay silent. You smile, you bend, and the world praises you for being understanding, selfless, kind. Yet inside, something small and fragile begins to crack. This is how manipulation begins, not as a weapon, but as a survival strategy. When you were young, you learned that your real feelings could cost you love. Maybe your tears were ignored. Maybe your anger was punished. Maybe your needs were treated like burdens. So you adapted. You learned to read the room before you spoke. You learned to soften yourself to avoid conflict. You learned that honesty is dangerous when love feels conditional. And now, years later, you move through the world carefully, managing emotions like a puppeteer controlling strings. Not because you want power, not because you want to deceive, but because the idea of being unloved still feels like death to the child living quietly inside your chest. So manipulation becomes a mask, one that smiles, apologizes, pleases, performs. A mask that protects you from the fear of abandonment. But there is a cost. For every time you silence yourself to maintain connection, you drift further away from the person you truly are. This is the story of how manipulation grows, first in innocence, then in shadow. And to understand how it becomes a prison, you must return to where it first began, childhood, where love was learned as a condition, not a home. Have you ever seen a child hesitate before crying, as if even their sadness needs permission? That hesitation is where the story begins. Not all wounds are loud. Some grow in silence, in rooms where affection is given with conditions attached. You don't remember learning these rules, yet they shaped everything. The rule was simple. If you want to be loved, you must be easy to love, and being. Easy to love meant hiding the parts of yourself that were inconvenient, emotional, or misunderstood. Picture a small child sitting on the edge of their bed, clutching their own fear like a secret. They want to cry, to call out, to be held. But the footsteps outside the door sound impatient. The air is heavy with unspoken expectations, so the child swallows the tears. They learn that pain expressed is pain ignored, but pain hidden is pain that doesn't threaten connection. And connection, to a child, is survival. Or imagine a child who gets praised for being mature for their age, for taking care of others, for never causing trouble. They learn that approval is earned by shrinking themselves, by catering to the emotional weather of the adults around them. They become the peacemaker, the caretaker, the one who adjusts and adapts before their own feelings even surface. Their emotional world becomes something private, hidden, protected like a fragile flame that might be blown out if exposed. Psychologists call this attachment conditioning the early shaping of how you understand love, safety, and belonging. The brain, still forming and delicate, learns to associate authenticity with danger and compliance with affection. So you begin to shape yourself in response to what keeps others close. You soften your voice. You learn to read micro-expressions. You anticipate needs before they are spoken. You become skilled at predicting emotional storms and adjusting yourself to prevent them. This is the earliest form of manipulation, but not of others, of yourself. A child learns to manipulate their own truth so love does not leave. It is not malicious. It is survival. It is the shadow version of love, formed in rooms where emotional honesty is too expensive to afford. So you grow up with a quiet belief stitched into your bones. If I show who I really am, I will lose the people I need. And that belief does not disappear just because you age. It becomes a mask you learn to wear with grace, with confidence, even with charm. What you become is not a villain. You become someone who learned to protect themselves before they ever learned to be themselves. And the mask you carry into adulthood began in the trembling silence of that child, waiting to be allowed to be real. There comes a point where you no longer remember when the mask was first put on. It sits on your face so naturally now that even you forget it's there. But the truth is, every smile you offer has a quiet tremor beneath it. Every "it's fine" carries a story your mouth refuses to speak. You learned early that vulnerability is dangerous, so adulthood becomes a stage where you perform safety instead of living truth. You move through conversations like a careful dancer, stepping lightly, measuring tone, anticipating reactions before words are even spoken. You laugh at jokes that cut you. You agree to plans you don't want. You apologize for things that weren't your fault, not because you're weak, but because you're terrified of the cost of being real. So you become good at shaping how people feel about you. You become the dependable one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs tension and smooths conflict before it rises. You give more than you have. You say yes when your entire body is whispering no. But hidden beneath that gentleness is exhaustion, the kind that gnaws at your ribs from the inside. Sometimes you use silence, not as peace, but as punishment. Sometimes you give love with the subtle expectation that it will be returned in equal measure. Sometimes you withdraw affection just enough to make someone notice. These things are small, quiet adjustments, barely visible. But they are manipulations not born from cruelty, but from fear. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being too much. Fear of being not enough. Psychologists call this adaptive identity formation, when your personality is shaped not from authenticity, but from what earns acceptance. The mask becomes a survival tool, a way to control how others see you so they don't see the parts of you still aching. In relationships, this looks like pretending you're okay with everything just to avoid conflict until resentment starts whispering dark things in the quiet hours. In friendships, it looks like always being the listener, the supporter, the steady one, until you realize no one knows how to support you. In the workplace, it looks like competence without voice, doing everything right but never feeling seen. Your mask is stitched from fear, and your smile hides the trembling underneath. And here is the truth that stings. You don't manipulate because you want to deceive. You manipulate because you're afraid that if you are fully seen, someone will decide you are not worthy of staying. But this mask, no matter how protective, is still a barrier between you and the world. And to understand it fully, we must look at what your mind was trained to believe, where survival wired itself into your psychology. Why does it feel easier to hide your feelings than to speak them? Why does your voice tremble when truth tries to escape your mouth? The answer isn't weakness, it's wiring. Your brain did not grow around honesty, it grew around survival. From the moment you were small, your nervous system was studying the emotional weather of your environment. It watched faces, tones, silences. It learned which words opened arms and which words closed doors. Psychologists call this attachment conditioning. If love was warm and safe, your brain learned openness. But if love came with unpredictability, cold one moment, tender the next, you learned caution. And if love was absent, distant, or overwhelming, you learned to disappear. These patterns become what attachment theory describes as avoidant, anxious, or disorganized styles. But to you, they don't feel like theory. They feel like instinct. When you learn to hide your needs to keep peace, your brain rewarded you. The amygdala, the threat center, calmed. Your heartbeat slowed. The body said, "Yes, this keeps us safe." And so the brain stored this strategy like a script. Don't speak too loudly. Don't want too deeply. Don't need too honestly. Manipulation in this frame is not a calculated act of power. It is your nervous system trying to prevent abandonment. The brain prioritizes connection over authenticity because when you were a child, losing connection felt like death. Survival meant being chosen, accepted, allowed to remain close. So, your adult mind learns to manage people the way you once managed caretakers. You soften truths. You over-explain. You withhold. You anticipate reactions and shape yourself to avoid pain. The amygdala fires when honesty feels risky, and the prefrontal cortex, the logical part, tries to negotiate safety by controlling outcomes. This is where the mask tightens. And then something subtle happens. Every time manipulation works, when someone doesn't get angry, when someone stays close, when conflict is avoided, the brain rewards the behavior. Dopamine reinforces it. The pattern strengthens. The mask feels necessary. But what once protected you begins to confine you. You find yourself surrounded by people, yet unseen by all of them. You feel cared for, yet profoundly alone, because no one is loving you. They are loving the performance. The brain learned to prioritize survival over truth, but survival and living are not the same thing. And at some point, the very strategy that once saved you begins to suffocate you. Because a life built on emotional camouflage cannot offer the one thing the heart quietly aches for, to be seen. And now the shadow begins to show where protection slowly turns into prison. What happens when the thing that once protected you begins to quietly destroy you? At first, the mask feels like armor. It shields you from rejection, from conflict, from the terror of being misunderstood. It lets you move through the world with control. But over time, armor becomes a cage, and the cage becomes a home you no longer know how to leave. You start to notice it in small moments. Someone says, "I care about you," and instead of warmth, you feel a strange hollowness. Not because the words aren't true, but because you know they were spoken to the version of you you've carefully constructed. The agreeable one, the calm one, the one who never needs too much, the one who never asks. And a thought begins to echo in the back of your mind like a slow burning truth. They don't love me. They love the mask. And that realization cuts deeper than loneliness ever could. So you give more. You perform harder. You contort yourself into shapes that please others, hoping someone might one day see through it on their own. But the more effort you give, the more invisible you become. The world praises you for being strong, mature, easy, selfless. Meanwhile, you are disappearing. This is the dark side, the shadow, the emotional debt that manipulation collects. The people around you begin to feel something is off, even if they can't explain it. They feel managed instead of met. They feel obligated instead of connected. They sense the subtle pressure in the air, the unspoken expectation that they should act, respond, feel a certain way. And slowly, distance forms, not from conflict, but from lack of truth. They begin to pull back. You feel the withdrawal, panic rises, and so the mask tightens again. Psychologists call this identity diffusion, the fading boundary between who you are and who you pretend to be. When you've spent years shaping yourself for others, you wake one day unable to answer the simplest question: what do I actually want? The loneliness here is not the loneliness of being alone. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people who cannot see you. It is the loneliness of living behind glass. And the cruelest irony is this: you did all of this to protect love. Yet in protecting love, you restricted your ability to receive it. You cannot be loved while wearing a mask. Only the mask receives the affection. And yet, the world often rewards this self-erasure. It praises the performance. It applauds the silence, which leads to the next tragedy: the way society teaches you to keep pretending. Have you noticed how the world praises the version of you that feels the least real? The polite one, the agreeable one, the one who never makes things uncomfortable. From childhood, you were taught a script. Be nice, don't upset anyone, good people sacrifice themselves. And while these lessons sound noble, they quietly teach you something else. Your truth is less important than your image. You learn early that the world prefers a polished version of you, a version without sharp edges, without trembling emotions, without needs that take up space. So you smooth yourself down. You soften your tone. You learn to hold back tears until you're alone. You train yourself to smile even when your chest feels tight and your voice feels small. And everyone applauds you for it. Teachers called you well-behaved. Friends called you easy to talk to. Family members called you the responsible one. And slowly you absorbed a message that took root like a quiet, persistent vine wrapping around your identity. Love is earned through performance. In adulthood, this performance becomes expectation. Society admires the selfless friend who always listens, the partner who never complains, the worker who never says no. You are rewarded for erasing yourself. You are celebrated for your emotional absence, so long as your smile remains. Then comes social media, the global stage. Here, image becomes currency. You present highlights, not humanity. Curated calm instead of chaos. You learn to pose your happiness, filter your sadness, and caption your life in ways that reassure others you are okay. Likes become proof of belonging. Validation becomes the new oxygen. And somewhere along the way, the line between who you are and who you perform begins to blur. But here is the quiet tragedy. The world cannot love you if it does not know you. And it cannot know you if you are always adjusting, polishing, perfecting, hiding. You begin to sense it in late-night thoughts, in crowded rooms, in conversations where you feel strangely distant even as you speak. A subtle emptiness, like living behind a pane of glass. You try to remember what your unfiltered self even feels like, but it's hazy now, almost unfamiliar. And the worst part is realizing how long you have carried the belief that authenticity is dangerous, that your unpolished self is too much, too heavy, too real. The world taught you to perform, and you listened because you were trying to survive. But every mask has a weight, and sooner or later, the effort of holding it in place begins to tremble. which leads to the quiet collapse that follows the emotional cost of being unseen in your own life. There comes a moment when you realize you no longer know yourself. Not in a dramatic way, but quietly, like waking up in a house you've lived in for years and suddenly not recognizing the hallways. You look at your life and feel something missing, something hollow. You've shaped yourself to be acceptable for so long that the original shape has faded. The person you once were has dissolved into the person others needed you to be. You crave closeness. You want to be understood. You want someone to look at you and say, "I see you." But when someone gets too close, closer than the comfortable distance of performance, your chest tightens. Vulnerability feels like standing barefoot at the edge of a cliff. So, without thinking, you push them away, not with anger, not with distance, but with subtle shifts changing the subject, withholding emotion, smiling instead of speaking truth. It is self-protection disguised as calm. And yet, when they finally drift, you feel abandoned. A heartbreak that feels unfair, yet familiar. You ache for connection, but the mask you wear does not allow it. You cannot be held if you do not reveal where you are hurting. You cannot be understood if you never speak your real language. Your relationships become something like shadows. You see the shapes, you hear the laughter, the conversations, the shared moments, but none of it touches the deepest part of you. You stand in rooms full of people who care about you, and still you feel invisible. It is not that they do not love you, it is that they are loving a version of you that does not include your truth. Psychologists call this emotional dissonance, the separation between your inner experience and your outer expression. The brain tries to hold both worlds together, but the heart notices. The heart counts the distance, and slowly, resentment begins to grow. Resentment toward others for not seeing you, but more painfully, resentment toward yourself for hiding. You start to feel heavy, tired in ways sleep can't fix, empty in ways distraction can't fill. The loneliness becomes a physical ache. Not the loneliness of being alone, it's the loneliness of knowing that even in connection, you remain unreachable. And here lies the heartbreaking truth. Manipulation is not control. It is a quiet form of self-erasure, a slow, graceful disappearance from your own life. But it doesn't have to stay this way. There is a way back, a way to return to yourself, slowly, gently, honestly, a way to let your voice become your own again. And that journey begins with learning how to speak without fear. Healing does not begin with a grand declaration. It begins quietly, often in the smallest moment. The moment you pause before agreeing. The moment you notice the tightness in your chest before you say, "It's fine." The moment you hear your own voice and realize it's too soft, too practiced, too careful. It begins the first time you allow yourself to wonder, what if I didn't hide? At first, speaking honestly feels dangerous. Your heart races, your breath shortens. The body remembers, because for years, your nervous system learned that truth leads to loss, that honesty risks abandonment. So vulnerability feels like stepping into open air with no guarantee you will land. The fear isn't irrational, it's familiar. The brain believes it is protecting you, but you are no longer that child who needed to shape themselves to survive. So the work now is not to force yourself to be unafraid, but to learn to feel fear and speak anyway. To let the trembling voice still be your voice. To allow truth to exist even when your hands shake. Healing begins when you start identifying the subtle moments where self-erasure happens. When you laugh at something that hurt. When you apologize for existing. When you make yourself small to avoid the risk of being too real. In those moments, instead of performing, you pause, you breathe, you ask yourself gently, what do I actually feel? What do I actually need? The first time you speak a small truth, I don't like that. I need some time. That hurt me. It will feel like you are doing something wrong. Your body will resist. Your mind will panic. But the world will not end. The sky will not fall. And slowly, your nervous system learns something new. Honesty does not always lead to loss. Boundaries become less about building walls and more about returning to your own shape. Communication becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about letting your heart have a voice again. And vulnerability begins to feel less like dying and more like breathing. The air may burn at first, but it is clean. You will lose some people along the way. Those who only love the mask cannot stay when the mask falls. But the love that remains, the love that grows after truth is real. It is rooted. It sees you. You do not need to be loved for who you pretend to be. You deserve to be loved for who you are, even in your trembling, even in your uncertainty, even in your becoming. Healing is not becoming someone new. It is returning to the self who was waiting beneath all the performance. And now, all that remains is the final question. What does it mean to live without the mask at all? What is a life if no one ever truly sees you in it? Not the version you polished for the world, not the agreeable smile or the practiced calm, but you, the heartbeat beneath the armor, the voice that trembles when it tells the truth, the child who once only wanted to be held without earning it. There is a quiet tragedy in living unseen. You may succeed, impress, achieve, charm, and yet still wake at night with a loneliness that feels older than your own name, because love cannot enter where walls remain. Affection cannot reach a person who is hiding, and no matter how close others stand, you cannot feel them if you are standing behind glass. You spent so long protecting yourself that you forgot what you were protecting. You learned to be understood without being known, liked without being felt, surrounded without being touched. The world applauded your composure, your gentleness, your adaptability, but your heart, the one place untouched by applause, knew the truth. You were performing a life instead of living one, and it is not your fault. You adapted to survive. You shaped yourself to be chosen. You believed that to keep love, you had to be small, careful, quiet. But now you stand at the threshold of a question you can no longer ignore. If you stopped performing, who might finally recognize you? There is fear here, yes. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being rejected, the fear of being too much or not enough. But beneath that fear is something older, softer, and far more powerful. The desire to belong without hiding. To be seen is to live. Not to be perfect, not to be unshaken, but to allow someone to stand close enough to notice the tremor in your hands and stay. To let someone hear the break in your voice and not turn away. To love and be loved without acting, without negotiation, without disguise. The truth you fear is the freedom you need. You will lose some people when you choose to be real, but those who leave were loving your mask. And the ones who remain, the ones who draw closer when your voice shakes, are the ones who were searching for you all along. You do not need to earn your place in the world by disappearing. You deserve to be chosen without disguising yourself. So let the mask loosen. Let the walls soften. Let your voice return to its own sound. Begin again, not as the version you built to survive, but as the person who is finally ready to live.